Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Michael Adams. I'm president of the Nebraska World Affairs Council, which we affectionately refer to as NUAC. I'm happy to welcome all of you to today's webinar, and I think you'll find it fascinating. I'll just say a few words about our organization, the Nebraska World Affairs Council, and then hand it off to my colleague, Betty Chin, who will introduce our guest speaker, Congressman Don Bacon. The Q&A following the presentation will be moderated by Dr. Patrick McNamara, Director of International Studies at UNO. So please feel free to insert questions into the chat box, and Patrick will deal with those after the presentation. Well, the Nebraska World Affairs Council's roots go back to 1972. So if you do the math, you'll know that next year is our 50th anniversary, which we're looking forward to. We're a nonpartisan nonprofit membership organization, and our mission is to provide educational programs and engagement opportunities together with a number of partners to our three targeted sectors, which we've identified as students, young professionals, and community leaders, so that they may become competent, informed global citizens in this very complex and interconnected world that we all live in. We encourage citizen-to-citizen diplomacy in a way to promote peace and mutual respect so that we may all thrive. Well, why do Nebraskans care about world affairs anyway? Annual surveys sent home with students indicate that there are over 120 languages spoken in the homes of Nebraska students. Nebraska, as you know, is a very rural state. We rank 37th in terms of population in the U.S., but we rank first, second, third, or fourth in various export categories. In fact, exports provide 62,000 jobs in the state and represent over 9% of Nebraska's economy. Our programs cover a wide range of world affairs topics, including issues like food security, conflict resolution, climate, U.S. foreign policy, human rights, international trade, cultural heritage, international education, just to name a few. I would like to invite all of you to follow us on Facebook and learn more about our programs and events. Global citizens are needed here, so please consider joining us. Thank you very much. Well, I will now hand it over to the microphone to Betty, who will introduce our guest speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Good morning, everyone. Our featured speaker is Congressman Don Bacon. The topic is current and emerging threats to U.S. national security. He will discuss the primary threats facing our country abroad, how those threats are changing. In addition, he will discuss whether or not our military is prepared to respond and what changes are needed to be made to our military. He grew up on a farm in Illinois, received a bachelor's degree in political science, Northern Illinois University in 1984. He joined the Air Force in 1985 and served nearly 30 years. He's retired in 2014 as a Brigadier General, earning 2 master's degrees from University of Phoenix and National War College. During his Air Force career, he specialized in electronic warfare, intelligence, reconnaissance, and public affairs. He is a highly decorated aviator as Wing Commander in Germany and Nebraska, Group Commander and Squadron Commander in Arizona, Expeditionary Squadron Commander in Iraq. As a combat veteran, he served 4 deployments in the Middle East during Operation Iraqi Freedom between 2007 and 2008. His military decoration includes Air Force Distinguished Service Medal, 2 Bronze Stars, 2 Legions of Merit, 5 Meritorious Service Medals. He was named Europe's top Air Force Wing Commander. He served as military advisor to Nebraska's Congressman Jeff Fortenberry of the 1st Congressional District. He was assistant professor at Bellevue University. He taught undergraduate leadership and American vision and values. In November 2016, Congressman Bacon was elected to represent Nebraska's 2nd Congressional District. He is serving his 2nd term now. And now it is my privilege to turn the event over to our distinguished speaker and my friend, Congressman Don Bacon.
Thank you. Betty, I appreciate the kind welcome. Thanks for everybody being on today. I look forward to having a fun discussion. I love discussing national security matters, sort of my hobby. So I like to read on my spare time. I'm on the Armed Services Committee. I serve in a lot of different caucuses that deal with national security and foreign relations. It's what I like doing. And but I really appreciate Betty Chen. She's been a great friend. And again, thanks for the welcome. And so I'm just going to start off with this. Now, I think we're very blessed. We live in a country for over the last 30 years has been the preeminent military power. We've also been the preeminent economic power for even beyond that. And we're blessed with great freedoms, you know, with our right to free speech and freedom to worship the way we'd like, and all those freedoms that we appreciate. Those values are very important. I'll come back to that when we'll talk about our world affairs. During my lifetime, and as with most of you that are on here, from what I could see on the camera here, you know, when I started out, we were in a bipolar world. It was us and the Soviet Union, and we would have never guessed in the mid '80s that within like just a few months, the Soviet Union would have collapsed, which we saw in 1989, right? That was a surprise. And we found ourselves quickly in a unipolar world where the US had this preeminent military strength, clearly the preeminent economic power at the time. And I'll never forget those words from George Bush, President 41, or you know, number 41 president, when he said that we were entering a time of a new world order. And there was this hope that we'd have all this peace, that our values would reign supreme. But that lasted for about a year. And then in 1991, we had Iraq invade Kuwait. And actually, it happened in August of 1990, but 1991, we were able to kick them out. What happened was the United States was able to totally and decisively defeat the fifth largest army in the world. And we used air power to a significant degree, precision weapons. We showed how to use space to integrate that. And coming out of that, there was zero doubt in anybody in the world who was this preeminent power, whether it was political or really whether it was economic or military at that point. And then we went through these a decade of the no-fly zone years in Iraq primarily. That all changed in 2001 when we had the 9/11 attack. And it really changed the national security strategy for our country, but also it took us to where we're at today. Let me explain. So for 20 years, our country's been focused with most of its military investments doing counterterror. And we took our eye off of what a near peer competitor, what we would need to help defend against someone like China or Russia. We put an enormous amount of investment into this counterterror fight. You know, initially with Afghanistan, primarily with Iraq, though, now a little bit with Syria as well. Let me just give you an example. You know, prior to in 2001, we were just starting this remote piloted aircraft capability. But a decade later, we were able to fly 60 remote piloted aircraft caps all the time, 24 hours a day, over Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria, and different parts of the Middle East. 60 aircraft were always airborne. Most of them are being flown out of Las Vegas, right? Where you could, a pilot in Las Vegas would steer the plane, and a second and a half later, the airplane would start turning over Afghanistan. And so I was a part of that buildup. Then we built the capability to actually fire munitions off these aircraft to hold targets at risk in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria from Las Vegas, believe it or not. Now, there's other parts where we fly these too now, not just Las Vegas. My point being is we spent a lot of our military focus on this counterterror going back 2 decades. And so when I got elected in 2016, our military was not in the best shape. It was doing a really good job in the counterterror. And as we looked at the emerging threats of potentially communist China, I don't like to talk about China general because we're friends with the Chinese. We're blessed with Chinese Americans here, but the communist government of China, that's what I'm referring to, was becoming an emerging threat. We still had Russia, we had Iran, we have North Korea. And we looked at our military capabilities, and we were we weren't in a good spot. So let me give you some examples of where we were at in 2016. Half of our Navy aircraft couldn't fly when I swore the oath coming into Congress. Half of our Navy aircraft. It's like, I think they say they're the second largest Air Force in the world, our Navy, right? We have 58 combat brigades in the Army. Only 3 could deploy. The Air Force had the oldest aged average aircraft age in the history of our Air Force. We were like at 25 years of age for the average age of our aircraft. Most of us don't drive 25-year-old cars. Just put it in perspective, right? And I can give you more examples. Our chairman of the Joint Chiefs and our service chief said that the readiness levels of our military was the worst it was since 1977. And that was coming out of the Vietnam years where we had the hollow force. We were back to the hollow force when it came to our near-peer competitor capabilities. Doing pretty good on counterterror, but in the near-peer capabilities, we were struggling. And so I want you to know that's where we were at in 2016. Pretty strong counterterror, but we were struggling with training, our modernization, all those key things when you look at China or Russia primarily. So then in 2017, we plus up our spending by about 10%. And as you look back, we cut our military by about 15% during the Obama years from our planned budgets. And let me just tell you, my voice is a little weak, so let me take a water. My voice has been weak for about 2 weeks, so just getting older. But during the Obama administration, through sequester, I don't blame him strictly, Republican Congress did it too, we cut military spending by about 15% while we're in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's how we got to the point where we were at. So 2017, we plus up our spending by about 10%, and we've kept it about there with inflation. And what that allowed us to do, it got our readiness levels up. So training, we're back to health. Our maintenance is back to health. But it's going to be a while before we get modernization back. And I'll come back to that. What is that? What areas that we need. So it gives you a little update with our military, how we got here. And we're going to come back later where we need to go. Let's go back to the world environment. This is the world we're looking at today. We have a communist China with a GDP that's equaling our GDP today. Now, some people say it's 85%, but when you look at buying power, it is equal. And that is a significant milestone for us. When communist China has enough GDP where they can put in 3.5% of their GDP for military, and most of their military is within their country. We're in Asia, we're in Europe, we're in the Middle East. We're spread out. We're doing space, we're doing cyber. China is able to focus primarily with the military inside of its boundaries, which makes it a pretty potent threat to Taiwan, Japan, Philippines, Vietnam, and so forth. And so having a country equaling our GDP it's a game changer when it comes to national security. But that's not it. We have to also think about Russia. Russia has the GDP of roughly Mexico, but its nuclear forces exceed ours right now. They have more nuclear weapons than the United States, and it's more modernized. 2 out of their 3 legs in their triad have been modernized. They have modernized submarines, and they have modernized ICBMs. Their bombers are actually newer than ours by and large, but they're still pretty old. And so they have a nuclear capability that matches ours or exceeds ours on a Mexico GDP budget. And we know just by looking at what they're doing in the world that they are adversaries. They seek to undermine our values and our agenda wherever they can, whether it's through election interference, trying to put wedges with our allies. We see what they did in Georgia, what they've done in Ukraine. They're clearly a threat to the Baltic states if we're not being vigilant and careful. So you got China that equals our GDP, Russia that's 10%, but yet has a nuclear capability exceeding ours. Then you have regional threats. You have Iran, who would like to be the leading power in the Middle East. They have visions of their Persian Empire. That's what motivates them. They want to go back to the days of old where they are the dominant regional power in the Middle East. I believe they are seeking a nuclear capability. They're the world's largest exporter of terror. Obviously very involved inside of Iraq, inside of Syria, in Lebanon. A terror threat to, say, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain. They're in Yemen with the Houthi rebels. They have 1,000 missiles that can strike Israel. Just to give you a data point. So we can't ignore that as well. You have North Korea with at the unclassified level 60 nuclear weapons, with a leader that I would say is largely unstable, but an economy that's just in devastating shape for its people. And so we have an unstable leader with 60 nuclear weapons. And then we still have the Al-Qaeda threat that's still in about 24 countries. And you still have still ISIS threat. They don't control any territory anymore, but there's still ability to conduct terrorism throughout most parts of the world. So that's the strategic environment we're in. And we went from this bipolar world to a unipolar world, back to a spot where I would say we're going back into a bipolar world with some multipolar characteristics there. That's sort of the world environment we're looking at. If I could maybe put some generalities on there. As a military, and I work with, as I work in the Armed Services Committee, we see China, Communist China, as a pacing threat for most capabilities, but Russia as the pacing threat when it comes to nuclear capabilities. So let's go back to how does the U.S. respond to this? First of all, I believe NATO is still the backbone to our national security. There were some things that in the previous administration I thought were good. He compelled NATO to increase military spending by $135 billion. I did not like the way he did it. I believe if you're going to treat your allies, and if you disagree with your allies, you do it in private. You don't scold them and belittle them in public. And our previous president did that all too often. But he did compel NATO to increase its spending. He also did the same with South Korea, Japan. But yet we still have some of our alliances have been undermined by the I would say the belligerent rhetoric that was not needed. Excuse me. But let me just repeat what my main point there. I believe NATO is still vital to our national security. If you look at what we've done in the Middle East over the last 2 decades, even though we weren't in Europe, we've always partnered with our NATO countries. The same will be true in the Pacific and other parts of the world. And our NATO allies will be our partners. Secondly, we're going to need NATO-like structures in the Pacific. We have a great bilateral relationship with Japan, Australia, a fairly good relationship with New Zealand. We want to grow a better relationship with India, and we're going to call that the Quad. If you hear that phrase, the Quad is called these multilateral talks with Japan, Australia, India, and United States. That is the basis of something we can build on and try to build a sort of a NATO-like organization to be a counter to what we're seeing in the Pacific. Also, I see some potential with Indonesia down the road, a democracy, a very populated country, a country that wants to do more with the United States. So I think NATO is important, but also I think we need a multipolar framework that we need to start building in the Pacific to counter what we're seeing there as threats. As to the military, strategic deterrence is still job number one. And I'm very concerned about where we're at today. When you look at Russia's modernized ICBMs, China is building ICBMs today, new bombers. They got a new submarine that's capable of launching ballistic missiles to hit the United States. The United States has sort of taken a modernization holiday here for about 2 decades. We have ICBMs that are 50 years old, B-52 bombers that are 60 years old. Our B-2s are now 30 years old. Their submarines are at the end of their shelf life. We have a huge modernization bill here. This is something we never want to use, but you have them for nuclear deterrence to ensure that we never use them again. Our nuclear force, by and large, is ranging between 30 to 60 years old, and it's in dire need of some upgrades. And I think that's a very important job that we have over the next 4 to 5 years to get done. Another area for the military that we've got to be thinking about is the 5th generation capabilities, is what we call it. That is the stealth capabilities. We're doing a pretty good job in working on stealth fighters, the 5th generation Navy. We've got some work to do on the ground forces, but an area that, when it comes to the Pacific area, we're in dire need of a new bomber, which we call the B-21 bomber. And that is probably the most important investment we could have for deterrence in Asia. I wanted to talk briefly a little bit about space and cyber electronic warfare. The United States uses space more than any other country. We use it for navigation, communications, intelligence. We leverage space more than any other country, which is a positive, but it's also a negative because it means we're the most vulnerable in that area. And China, Communist China and Russia know that. And they've developed capabilities to target our satellites. So if we ever have a day one of a war, which I hope we never do, you can count on, whether it's Russia or whether it's China, they will target our space and they will conduct cyber against Manhattan, our financial district, as well as our infrastructure. Turn off my phone here, somebody's calling me. So, and they'll target our energy sector as well. That's what you're going to look at in a day one of a conflict. So when we look at that, we need to figure out, what does our space look like in the future? Up until a few years ago, we were building satellites with 5 or 6 missions on them. You can't do that anymore because those become the first day targets. We got to build smaller satellites with single missions on them and have a plethora of them so that it doesn't become economical to target all those satellites. But when you put a satellite with 5 different missions, it becomes a big fat target. And so our space, we're having to modernize our space with the threats in mind. And cyber is very similar to that. US is also the best at using the internet and cyber to our advantage. But it also makes us the most vulnerable, just like space. And so we've had to really work hard to develop defensive capabilities to defend our own networks. And our military's done a pretty good job when it comes to building defensive capabilities in our cyber. We also have offensive capabilities. But where we're struggling is, how do we defend our private sector? And how do we defend our energy sector? Because that's not part of the military. We've made some improvements there, but we just got to realize our adversaries on day one of a war will never separate a military cyber target from an important economic target. And so we're going to have to think about how we're going to defend our private sector, our private infrastructure from these cyber attacks. We've made strides, but we're not there yet. Also, in the electronic warfare space, for those who aren't familiar with that term, the electronic magnetic spectrum is where you use your radar, your radio communications, the ability to talk to your satellites. It's the electronic magnetic spectrum. In the mid-90s, the United States dominated this domain. And I call it a domain. It's a physical domain. Because we were so dominant in 1991, we stopped investing and we didn't see a need. But Russia and China did. They saw how good we were at it. And they actually have out invested in this area for the last 2 decades. And I would say that they gained superiority in this area. And the problem is, if you can't talk to your satellites, if you can't talk to your ships, if you can't talk to your airplanes, if you can't use your radars, you're in trouble. And so we have a domain here where we're behind and we're having to invest significantly to catch up. I think we made some strides in the last 4 years here as well, but we're not quite there yet. Finally, when you look at U.S. strengths and where we're going, you can't have a strong national security and a strong military without a strong economy. And one of the vital things that our government's got to do is ensure we have the fundamentals right for a strong economy. And we've got to look at our supply chain. I think we see in COVID where we've grown dependent in some areas that creates vulnerabilities. I'll give you an example. We have zero right now penicillin production capabilities in our country, right? Those are things that we need to review to see if that makes sense. And what do we need to bring back home? Or where do we need to diversify our supply chain? So some closing thoughts. I believe the United States is the indispensable nation in the world when it comes to defending freedom and human dignity, human rights. But when you look at the world environment, we cannot do it alone. It's impossible. When you have one nation that already matches our GDP, by definition, you can't do it. And you have not just that one threat, you got multiple threats. The United States needs to be a voice. Without us, our values, the values that we like and that we want to see more dominant in the world, will grow dim. If we're silent, the values of communist China or the values of the oligarchy in Russia will grow preeminent in the world, and those values of human rights, religious freedoms, freedom of speech, all those things that we value will diminish. America has to be a strong voice for these values. But we also got to realize we cannot do it alone. We have to have strong allies. NATO is so important. Japan, Australia, I could go on and on. So one of our goals is to strengthen our alliances of countries that share our values and to do burden sharing in the defense of these freedoms. And I think that's the main takeaway I want to give you today. Also want to re-stress economic power cannot be overlooked. When we grow weak economically, you can't sustain everything else that you need to do. And my very closing point is, yes, a strong military is important. A strong economy is important. But our values are our most lethal weapon in the world. When I travel in Micronesia, when I travel in Africa, yes, there's economic incentives that other countries offer to build ports, build roads. But in the end, these countries like free markets. The people want freedom. And that's what America stands for. We're that light on the hill when it comes to the values of freedom. And that we cannot forget as we work with our allies and work in the world on that. So our values are still most important. So with that, I'd be glad to take questions. I appreciate the opportunity to share.
Thank you, Representative Bacon. That was a great talk, and I'm always impressed. I have to work from notes when I'm giving a lecture, but you are off the top of your head. You've been living this stuff for decades. I mean, this is your wheelhouse, right?
This is what we talk about in committee hearings.
Right on. Well, I'm going to invite anyone who wants to pose a question to type that into the chat. I'm I'm going to take the first question from a friend, Rick Burns, who actually served in Afghanistan and has been the point person for the sister cities relationship between Council Bluffs and Herat in Afghanistan. And just a great guy and a great community
So
leader.
I've been to Herat.
Yeah, right. So he asks about the May 1st deadline to withdraw troops from Afghanistan. Do you have any take on that upcoming deadline and what might be happening in some back channel negotiations?
Well, I've heard mixed signals from the Biden administration. On one hand, they're saying we're not going to withdraw fully out of Afghanistan, but then I heard this week that we may by the end of the year. So we're getting mixed signals out of the Biden team on this. Here's my general thoughts on it. Of course, a position can change based on facts on the ground. So if we see facts change on the ground, we can revise our position. But I think there's going to be a need for a small U.S. presence in Afghanistan. I surely don't want a big presence. A small presence, though, keeps the leadership at Kabul in place. It gives them some backbone, if you will, to help keep them there. The last thing we want is to fully pull out of Afghanistan and have the Taliban take over. The Taliban are still allied with Al Qaeda, and they have in their view, a moral commitment to Al Qaeda. So I don't think that has not changed. And if the Taliban take over Kabul and become the power in Afghanistan, right now they have 40% of the territory, roughly. So it's not a good situation. But they don't have Kabul. They can't build Al Qaeda training camps without us hitting them right now. But if we pull out, they will take over Kabul, let's say in 2 years, 3 years, probably. And they can build the same training infrastructure that they had prior to 9/11. And I think you'll be back to where we were at 20 years ago. And so a small presence of no more than 5,000, perhaps less, helps keep our friendly government in charge in Kabul. And we still have 60% of the territory, roughly. And right now, the Taliban can't just freely, even in the areas they control, can't have a training camp. We target it pretty easily. So that's my recommendation. Until we see the Taliban change its ways, they are, as long as they're wedded to Al Qaeda, I don't see that we can really change their policy. But the facts on it, a lot of people say, what about the cost? Well, right now, I would say we want a minimal cost day to day in Afghanistan. If you pull out, yes, you're going to save money for 2 years. But what are you going to do in 2 years when Taliban have Afghanistan and they're building training camps? And there may be a need that you got to go back in. The cost becomes more at that point. So I'd rather have a minimal cost to sustain what we have. That said, there's no easy answer. There's no perfect answer. Some solutions are imperfect, and that's what we have in Afghanistan.
Thank you. I want to invite another question from one of our star international studies alumni, Adrian Cavill. Adrian is now working at the Nebraska State Department of Economic Development. And you actually, at the end of your talk, talked about the strong economy being the key to national security, referring to supply chains and some other things. Adrian's question is, can trade levers and economic pressure play into that national security? And maybe if I can put a finer point on that question, how might Nebraska's state economy play into that national security, bigger picture, trade levers and such?
Well, we are an export state. If you look at the 50 states, we're one of the few, we're one of the small minority of states that are a net exporter. And that's the strength of our economy. But of course, when you have trade wars like we had, it gives us some vulnerabilities too. But the U.S. agriculture is one of 4 or 5 areas that we have a competitive advantage. know we can grow corn, soybeans, beef, pork, things like that more efficiently than Americans. We are the world's leaders in production in these areas. And so our goal is to open up trade doors because that's our economic advantage, competitive advantage. But other countries know that. When I traveled to Europe, they say, Don, we want free trade except for agriculture. I said, well, that's not fair. You can't just do that, right? But we want to sell you our Mercedes, our BMWs, our red wine from southern France, but we don't want your beef or pork. Well, it's got to be fair as well. So I'm a big believer for Nebraska's economy, more trade, more agriculture, open doors, the better for us. That's just a fact of life. But a lot of countries too want to save their small farmers. That's the problem. They're trying to save their farmer with 50 cattle. And they know that there's places in Nebraska where guys have 100,000 head of cattle, one rancher, which I know that guy, right? So that's unheard of when you go to UK or Germany, right? So back to Adrian's point, I think it's better to use economic levers than military levers any day. Military levers cost people's lives. And I study Clausewitz, I study Sun Tzu, I study Jomini. You don't know what's going to happen in a war. A small military action can turn into World War I, right? And so I think we've got to be so cautious with military instruments of power. Economic instruments give us some things that I think can be short of war that help fulfill our national security objectives. And like right now we have Myanmar, right? That could be some areas where you can use more economic and diplomatic levers of power. And we were using economic levers of power with China in the last 4 or 5 years, trying to equal the level of the playing field when it came to trade. And so I do think that's true, but we got to know when we do that. Nebraska's export is what's held at target by these other countries, which makes it hard on us. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, Adrian, too well, other than the economic levers are very important. There's 4 different instruments of power, and the economic is one of them. And it's been the preferred over military for a good reason.
Adrian, great question. Thank you for that. And thanks for the work that you do on behalf of the state of Nebraska in economic development. I want to stick with that point about Myanmar and some of what's going on in Southeast Asia. As you know, you have addressed our Young Southeast Asian Leaders Initiative, YSEALI, which is a grant from the U.S. State Department that we've had at UNO since 2015. My colleague Val McPherson, who's on the line, and I both work on that with the whole team of people who aren't on the line now. But I just wonder, as you think about ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and that Southeast Asian dynamic that is happening now, how do you see that both as a hedge to the rise of China in the region, as well as some of the particular dynamics where, like in Myanmar, you have the military junta having staged this coup? I wonder if you could just speak to that region a little bit.
Well, the share of the GDP in that part of the world is growing. So the economies there are growing at a very fast rate. And most of those countries also fear communist China. They see them as a threat, especially in the innermost countries that are bordering China. It's interesting to talk to Vietnam, and they'll tell you their number one threat's China. Their number one ally is the United States. Now, who would have thought that after 1973, right? Or 75. And but that's that area, that whole area there shares that fear because Beijing throws this weight around and expects, I would say, subordination, but maybe partial subordination to their interests. But to directly answer your question, the economic power in ASEAN is growing, and the United States has to recognize that. I thought it was a mistake to pull away from the TPP. My view is we had the ability to build an economic alliance and to provide favored trade status with the United States and our economic allies in Asia. And it also put China on the defensive economically with their trade. When we disbanded TPP or pulled out of it, we actually gave China an advantage because they could do bilateral talks as easily as we could. And it really weakened our ability to counter the unlevel trade that we had there. And so I would suggest to the new administration to relook at TPP and figure out how do we get in? How do we write something? How do we, what modifications do we need to make? And frankly, what we've done with USMCA is a good starting point with any of our trade now. It really was an upgraded trade agreement coming out of NAFTA. It's a prototype that we're using in other trade bilateral. We can maybe hopefully grow that to more multilateral ability. But frankly, if we want to be a leader of countries with our values, it can't just be military, it's got to be economic. And I think the TPP is something we need to relook at again. Unfortunately, a lot of people think just President Trump pulled out of that, and he did, but also his Democratic opponent opposed it as well. And so we lost a consensus in our country on the need for this. And I think we need to have that discussion and realize that we gave away part of our playing field when we pulled out of that. And I think it hurt us in the short run and long run. I don't know if I answered your question adequately there, but I tried.
Yes, that was terrific. Thank you. Another question comes from my colleague in the UNO Political Science Department, Beth Cholecki, who is now a fellow at the Wilson Center in DC. Beth, yeah, of course you have, right. So Michael Adams, our president of NUAC, also is asking this question about climate change as a national security issue. How would you prioritize defending against this threat of climate change?
I don't really compare it to China, Russia, Iran, but it's something we got to factor in our overall strategy. But I don't like to equal it to China and Russia. I just think when the average citizen hears that, and I think it loses some credibility. But the fact is, we got issues. When you look at our ports today, when the water levels increase 1 millimeter or 2 millimeters every year, that's not bad for a year or two, but when you do it over 20 years, that has a bad effect on our dry docks. So that's just a case in point where the changing environment's having a significant factor for us with our military in various ways. So I think that we need to have, whether it's in our DOD, but it's much beyond our DOD, a strategy to deal with the climate change and change our environment. So I think that's a given. And I would say to Beth, yes, it's got to be factored in our strategy, our national strategy, not just military strategy, but a broader strategy. But I would say too that some people want to say it's like a threat equal to China, Russia, or Iran. I just think that doesn't do a service to this discussion. I think you lose some people when it's said that way. But I'm a big supporter of a blended energy plan. I think we need green energy, but it can't do 100% right now. In Omaha, it's 40% of our energy is renewables. I think we should all be proud of that, frankly. But natural gas is still an important part. We're not going to be able to walk away from that anytime soon. And so I think a blended approach is what the country needs right now, with a heavy dose of it being renewable. And this carbon capture technology that's being developed, I think, is significant. And you can capture carbon and then use it for manufacturing. That's, I think, a tremendous technology that's it's coming our way.
Thank you. Charlie's asking about the border and in particular the Biden administration's policies around border security. What are your thoughts on that, Representative Bacon?
So, there was a lot of harsh criticism of the previous administration on this and inhumane treatment. But what we have today, in the name of being humane, we've actually increased the inhumane reality. So in other words, you can have humane goals, but if it leads to increased inhumanity, it's not a good thing. When you have, so we're at a 20-year high of illegal border crossings. I think we need to realize the truth of it. A third of all women who are coming across the border right now are being raped. That is the average. It is savage what a lot of these people go through to cross northern Mexico into the United States. And so I see it as a crisis. You have a lot of kids, children being part of this trafficking problem as well. And so what happened was the previous administration had 3 new rules in effect, if you will. They stopped what we call catch and release. They forced the refugees to have to be to go through Mexico to be processed. And these basic principles served as a deterrence, frankly, and it shut down a lot of the illegal border crossings. Now, Grant, I think COVID played a factor here too, just to be honest. But we had a 20-year low in illegal border crossings. Now we've hit a high in that area. And I think a lot of it was done because a desire for more humanity, but the reality of it's been the opposite. And so I'm more of a moderate when it comes to immigration. You know, I favor DACA. I was actually one of the first Republicans to do so. And I think we changed that narrative in the Republican Party to where now it's about 50-50 there. And I think I was one of the first there. TPS, I've got a more moderate view. But you got to have rule of law on your border too. And so I'm one of those who think you got to have rule of law at the border, a secure border. You know, we've recently captured 4 people on the terrorist list coming across the border, right? So how many got through without us knowing? I don't know. When I was there, we caught Iranians coming across the border. And so that's the reality. And I think, and we need to know the reality too, the victimization that's going on with those who are crossing. It's terrible. So I'm a proponent for a strong rule of law at the border and a strong legal immigration system. I think our country benefits from it. I would like to point out that the 2 best heart surgeons we had in Omaha for decades were from India. Now they're retired, but we've benefited from a strong immigration with high-skilled and low-skilled laborers. And so I support maybe increasing the aperture on the legal side, but we got to have a secure border.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a question now from Bobby Brumfield, who served in the military as a veteran as well as a security professional. He asks, with China and Iran's 25-year agreement and the traditional relationship with Russia, what is the plan to counter what's happening in Africa, South America, other places? I want to maybe pick up a second thread of this question and ask from my colleague in the political science department here at UNO, Janet Riley, asks about China's soft power and particularly the issue of human rights. Of course, the Belt and Road Initiative that China is engaged in with soft power and especially economic power, building infrastructure around the world. How do we begin to counter some of that soft power that China and others are projecting in parts of the world that we would consider, as you talked about, more of an ally in terms of the values that we share?
Well, we can't do it alone. So in Asia, I've enjoyed talking to the Australian leaders, the Japanese leaders, to help us with investments in micro-Asia. So with this Belt and Road Initiative, you hear the examples in multiple countries where China loans to country X, and we're going to give you, $200 million. I'll build this port, and you're going to pay us back at this level rate. And then 5 years later, the country can't do it. and China takes over the port. And that's what's going on. You're seeing sort of a predatory initiatives with using economic power to gain a foothold all over Africa, Asia, Central America too, by the way. And it's if those loans can't be repaid, you're seeing those infrastructures being taken over by China. And so, but how do we contend with that? Well, first of all, I think we need to warn countries, if you can't pay, this is what's going to happen. But a lot of them don't care. They got the port built, they're still able to use it. They're not too concerned that China's operating the port in a lot of these cases. But I think we have to contend. We got to know that's reality right now. And America can't do it alone. We got to work with our France. When it comes to Africa, France is an important player in this, and other European countries. Then we get to Asia, Japan, and Australia too. And so it's got to be a team effort. We got to contend. We got to know this is reality. But I do think when we look at soft power, I think beyond the economic side of it too, I think we need to be clear what's going on with the Uyghurs, or what's going on in Xinjiang. Can't pronounce it right, but you know what I'm saying, on the border there with Afghanistan. I think the underbelly for both China and Russia is the values area, and it comes back to our values is our most important weapon, and we should let that shine. Now, I think we did harm to ourselves on January 6th. It made me so angry to see that America, the world's greatest democracy and our oldest republic, to have that thing happen at the Capitol it dimmed our light, and that hurt our values. Peaceful transition of power is one of the things that makes our country special, right? A lot of countries struggle with that, and that hurt us. But with all that said, it's still our strength. And so soft power, I think in the end, is America's strength, because soft power is about ideas and values. China, though, is using its economic power to a significant degree, and we cannot ignore it. We have to try and counter it.
General Mattis, when he was Secretary of Defense, said, if you don't fully fund the State Department, you're going to have to buy me more bullets.
Right.
The idea that soft power, that diplomacy is really at the forefront there. And I appreciate what you said there.
We probably got a little bit different terms. I look at power. You got economic power, military power, diplomatic power. But soft power is sort of it's our culture, our values of freedom, human rights, human dignity. That is America's strength. But I think we've weakened it with our hyper-partisanship, our vitriol towards each other. Right now, we're sort of showing the world that democracy is struggling. And we've got to overcome this internally, because we're hurting ourselves and we're hurting the cause of freedom with the internal strife that we're having in Washington, D.C. And but that soft power has traditionally been a strength for us. We can't lose that. I think that's more important than military power, economic power, anything else.
My friend Marong Zhang from Creighton University is also asking about this same sort of China's military power, and I'm going to add a little bit to the question here, but specifically with regards to President Xi and the so-called community of shared future for humankind, the Chinese values that are being put out by the Chinese. How do you think that U.S. soft power, the cultural and diplomatic, the public diplomacy stuff, can be better positioned to counter, especially China at the UN and other places now in these international bodies, really putting forward a different sort of philosophy and values system?
I think Beijing could talk that story, but all we have to do is look at Hong Kong, where they were talked about one country but two systems, but that's no longer reality. Hong Kong has lost its freedoms. to run for office in Hong Kong, you have to have permission from China to run. Well, that's not free elections. They've lost their freedom of the press. I think what we see with the Uyghurs, that we have to articulate this, that is the world that we're going to if we go that path. And it's the power of an oligarchy, of a dictatorship of a party. That is not freedom. That is not freedom of the press. It's not freedom of religion. And, home churches in China get persecuted. I could just go on and on. We have to articulate that. And I've always been inspired by when Ronald Reagan, I can't remember what year he said it was, but when he called Russia the evil empire, the establishment laughed at it and scoffed at it because they saw the world as, American, Russia, and Soviet Union, two powers vying for power, but sort of as roughly equivalent. Reagan sort of redefined it, that there was a moral right and a moral wrong. There was not moral ambiguity. There was moral, there was not ambiguity. There was clarity. And I think we need to remember that there's an important role for American leaders to put the spotlight on persecution, genocide, religious persecution, and so forth. And that countries, like leaders in Moscow and Beijing, Tehran to a degree, that's worse than about anything else. Moral clarity, I think, is very important in this environment. And, what Reagan did was, when you hear some of the dissidents in Siberia said it was a game changer, having a leader have that moral clarity. I think we could use that again.
Congressman, I apologize. This is James, but we have to move on to your next meeting. I apologize, Patrick.
Thanks, James. Thanks for keeping him on target, on task, on time.
Yeah.
Don, thank you for your service. Thank you for what you're doing for our state and our country. Appreciate your time with us today. Thank you. I was
honored. And honored to be with all of you. And like I said, I recognize so many on here. I appreciate you. And thank you for the opportunity to serve you. And thank you for your time.
Thank you. As you exit, I'm going to pass it back over to Michael Adams to close us out, please.
Well, on behalf of the Nebraska World Affairs Council, I want to thank the speaker, Congressman Don Bacon, for really a fascinating and informative and insightful discussion. And thank you to all of the attendees for tuning in today. The session has been recorded. We will be posting a video of it on our Nebraska World Affairs YouTube channel. Our next Zoom presentation will be on integrating refugees into local Nebraska rural communities on April 20th at noon. So be sure to tune in for that. And for a full list of all of our events, see our Facebook site for Nebraska World Affairs. Thanks again to everybody, and we hope to see you at another one of our upcoming events.